With the U.S. presidential election just in the weeks ahead, I wanted to explore what the leading candidates' policies would mean for your money, your investments. When we look at the betting markets, we see that, and this is via Polymarket, where over $600 million has been bet. So when there's that much money on the line, I think it is worth paying attention to. This is varied. So far, it's suggesting that it's a very close race between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. However, it has fluctuated, over the last few weeks. At one point, Kamala Harris was in the lead, close to 55% odds that she would win. However, subsequently, as her economic policies have been leaking out, her odds have been dropping. We'll talk about her economic policies in just a second. I think it is worth calling out, though, as you're going to see with President Biden's tweet here, which is that it was just a month ago that he was doubling down on, I'm the sitting president of the United States. I'm the nominee of the Democratic Party. I'm staying in the race. That was literally, July 5th. So not that long ago. And so anything, politicians share, it needs to be taken, with the understanding that there's a good chance it could change significantly in the future, depending on the circumstances. So let's try to take an honest appraisal. I'm not trying to have a partisan perspective of like, oh, this is the candidate I'm rooting for. That's not it. I'm trying to have let's have a meeting of the minds to reflect on what will these economic policies potentially do, the good and the bad. Is this compelling or attractive, and how could it impact you from an investment perspective? If this is your first time tuning in, my name is Daniel. You're watching Unrivaled Investing. And so looking at Kamala Harris, I went to her official website. This is what you see currently. It's effectively a bio about her, Tim Walz, take action effectively, and ways to donate, a store, buy stuff, take action. What I find particularly lacking is any sort of key points like, hey, here are the top 5 values or top 20 initiatives that we're going to be doing. And it's honestly, I'm a huge fan of Hamilton, the musical. And instantly looking at this, it reminded me of that phrase from the musical, like, if you stand for nothing, Burr, what will you fall for? And I'm looking at this, I'm like, what are the key values that you're, pounding the table on? And I think this is sort of the uncertainty that you have. So I'd prefer to go to the primary resource, just like, any sort of investment, go to the primary documents. But if I, have to go to the secondary sources about what she's mentioned or newspapers. So here's from PBS, from an Associated Press journalist, talking about how Harris has proposed a slew of new economic policies. The top one, the first one that's mentioned, is food prices, relating to how food prices have been out of control and they want to stymie inflation. Let's help the U.S. consumer. And her view is that during her first 100 days in office, she's going to send to Congress a proposed federal limits on price increases for food producers and grocers. Personally, I think this is absolutely bananas. I ask ChatGPT, like, hey, show me an image of what you think the outcome would be from price controls. And it's not that hard to see. I mean, what you end up having are empty shelves and hunger, because if you have that sort of system in place, the initial reaction is like, oh, great, prices aren't going to go higher. But in any sort of system, you need to have feedback. And the feedback is that if you limit the price in which, goods can be sold, what you're really talking about is a limit on the producer profits. And keep in mind, grocery stores, they're only making a couple of cents for every dollar. It's really, the end producers. It's really who's manufacturing it, and they're passing along their input costs. So it's not like they're having Apple type margins of, 30, 40%, Google type margins. You're talking about, for the most part, commodity products where they're not having outstanding margins. And so they need to have, food prices that reflect their input costs. When you put a ceiling on that, it starts making it such that there's less of an incentive for them to produce. And ultimately, the long-term impact of price ceilings like this is that you do get things like shortages and hunger. It's been tried countless times before. And frankly, I find it to be bottom of the barrel, like, how are you coming up? Why would this be the first thing you'd mention? And I think it's not surprising that Kamala Harris, in terms of her odds of winning, actually dropped following this. Like, why even bring this up? This is a terrible policy. Another policy that's been proposed is that first-time home buyers will get $25,000 credit effectively from the U.S. government to cover the down payment. So this is to encourage, to effectively make it easier. She's saying, hey, I've heard your pain that things cost more. I've heard your pain that home prices cost more. And so she has also mentioned, hey, let's get more supply on the market. But when I look at this is really addressing the demand side and thinking about the potential impact. What you're really talking about is worsening the U.S. deficit with this investment by the government to say, hey, new home buyers, $25,000, and really just jacking up home prices. So I view this as additional stimulus for demand, not really addressing the supply aspect in as much detail as I'd want. I wouldn't want to have a mutual supply and demand. I just want supply. If you want to lower prices, it's about increasing the supply, not necessarily juicing demand. So I view this yet as another policy that's largely misguided. It seems to be, it doesn't seem like a leading policy. I'm not going to cover everything that both candidates have proposed. I'm going to cover some of the key things that I've seen so far. And so another key one is that she's expecting, Vice President Kamala Harris is expecting to raise the corporate tax rate from currently 21% under Trump's law to around 28%. The immediate impact of that would be a 10% hit to earnings and that's just simple math. I mean, if you're raising the tax rate from 21 to 28%, that is roughly a 10% hit to earnings. So if nothing else changes, you are talking about a 10% hit to the market. And I'd argue this would create additional volatility, uncertainty, where you could have, even more of a contraction because, the three drivers of returns are the cash flow to shareholders, the change in valuation, and the change in fundamentals. And so even if the valuation doesn't change at all, this tax rate would hit the fundamentals to the tune of 10%. And I'm saying the valuation could also come under pressure just because of uncertainties. There's data points. This is the problem when you don't put out crystal clear on your website. Here are my key points. This is my platform. I hope she changes it. I would love to have more clarity, where there's, articles suggesting that, hey, there's going to be a tax on unrealized capital gains, which I think, I think that's just absolutely crazy. That could definitely cause uncertainty and significant valuation. I mean, that could cause significant valuation compression when you have the billionaires, the founders of, major corporations forced to sell large stakes in their business to cover this tax bill. I mean, I don't see the merits behind this at all. As always, this is not financial advice. I'm going to, cover President Trump's, proposals in just a second. Also, quick plug. Recently, Michael, a premium member of the Unrivaled Investing community, shared the following. This is a direct quote. So far, the subscription has paid for itself in 3 months. Looking forward to what the future holds. If you're looking for compelling investment ideas, come check out Unrivaled Investing. I also have educational courses as well. When I go to President Trump's website, he actually does a fairly good job laying out his points. It's not perfect, I would say, but it's better than nothing. Going through these points, let's think about the economic impact. Number 2, carry out the largest deportation operation in American history. That's honestly, pretty ballsy to put that there. That's effectively saying, hey, a lot of the illegal immigrants that have come across the border, you're talking about hundreds of thousands, if not millions over the last 4 years. He's looking to reverse some of that. Now, the immediate impact, once again, let's think about the economic impact for you, which is that a lot of businesses do run on, super low cost labor, sometimes illegal labor. And what you're talking about is if you have that type of mass deportation, you're impacting supply. So I would expect to have some sort of higher prices for consumer. That said, the next sentence he's saying, look, end inflation and make America affordable again. Sort of nebulous. Glad to hear him talk about ending inflation, but that's sort of like, let's end bad stuff, like nobody wants bad stuff. Let's end inflation. But I want something tangible to bite into, and neither candidate, I think, are really giving prudent ideas. One is suggesting, let's stop prices from going up. Let's put ceilings in place, which is just frankly stupid. Then talking about making America the dominant energy producer. Okay, so maybe some sort of incentives, lower taxes, possibly to increase oil supply. That could result in lower inflation. over time. So maybe that offsets some of the labor supply dynamic here. Overall, I'd say a muddied economic policy here, large tax cuts for workers. So that could help juice demand. If consumers have more money to spend. We're going to talk about where is this money coming from in just a second, because he's also proposing, this isn't on the website as far as I can tell, he's also proposing sizable tariffs for pretty much everybody, favorable counterparties, not so favorable counterparties. This once again strikes me as poor economic policy, because the end impact is ultimately, just the higher cost of goods that U.S. consumers are going to bear the brunt. And usually tariffs result in some sort of tit for tat policy. I just don't understand why these sort of wackadoodle ideas, price ceilings, $25,000, stimulus for home buyers, 20% tariffs, like unrealized capital gains, like these are just crazy ideas. They ultimately, these are fringe ideas, in my opinion, that don't reflect mainstream ways to actually help the consumer. So this is a little bit surprising. So I'm not trying to say like, hey, one candidate's better than the other. I'm just honestly calling out, like, some of these policies don't make any sense to me. I certainly don't get the tariff perspective. And you've had several prudent economists, like Larry Summers say, hey, that's an easy way to stir up inflation, increase inflation for consumers. And it makes sense. If you have a tariff, ultimately consumers are going to be spending more. Now, maybe that does help from a tax collection perspective, maybe one perspective. So maybe you increase tariffs, have consumers spend more, and on these items, and then it's offset by maybe you lower corporate taxes. And this has been another policy that President Trump has discussed, lowering the federal corporate tax rate again. He previously lowered it to 21%, now lowering it again to 15% if reelected. That, in the opposite direction of the raising the tax rates, this would have the opposite impact of potentially boosting earnings to the tune of 8%. So that could juice the market from here. So this could help, potentially U.S. investments. But I think, once again, you have this level of uncertainty, some sort of like some chaos energy here with President Trump, where, a lot of people say, look, he's just sort of, talking off the cuff, and, sometimes he says things that he doesn't actually mean. And so you've had comments from him saying, look, he would like to control the Federal Reserve or have more influence. And then more recently, he's been talking about, a president shouldn't directly control, he wouldn't directly control the interest rates, so he thinks he has good judgment. Personally, I think that's a huge concern that investors need to be mindful of, which is that you do not want a president controlling the central bank and controlling interest rates. That's an easy way to get monetary policy to be completely out of whack with where it should be. And it's the job of the central bank, even though they don't always do a great job, it's their job to say, hey, we're going to pull away the punch bowl when, the party's really starting to get going, and we're going to help stimulate it when people are down in the dumps. And you do not want a president that's going to start taking that over for political reasons, because then you could really get, the US dollar to fall apart. You can have inflation dramatically pick up, because then outside observers say, hey, I don't trust your monetary policies. You're lowering interest rates when times are, when things are great. That is not what you should be doing. And this is, go back into history. There's a fantastic book on Lords of Finance, that effectively shows you how the Great Depression was in large part caused by misplaced policies by central bankers and leaders, where, they were, the U.S. government, the federal bank was, the Federal Reserve was cutting into a booming economy to help, balance with the currencies, with the UK. And this ultimately led to a bubblicious market that did result in the Great Depression. So, I think it is so important to keep the Federal Reserve separate from the executive branch of the United States. And honestly, probably the most important thing, the elephant in the room, if you will, is actually the U.S. deficit, which is currently running around 6 to 7%. This is, record in terms of the last time we were here. You're talking about World War II, and we are not spending on anything that's nearly as important as defeating fascism. And, layer in ridiculous spending, 6, 7%. So the existing legislators, they are not appropriately reacting to what I believe is a 5-alarm fire in terms of how U.S. spending is, what's going on right now. And then you see that the economy is slowing down. Just earlier today, the Labor Department saying, whoopsie doopsie, non-farm payrolls was actually 800,000 worse than we were expecting. So I'm looking at these different aspects, and you might have a unemployment starting to pick up, and normally you would have the deficit to sort of offset that, say, hey, let's give out some benefits to the unemployed. We're not I'd say the US government is not in a position where it can easily step that up, easily say, hey, let's expand our deficit spending. So navigating going from, let's say, 6 to 7% annual deficit expected to go higher over time to, let's say, 1 to 2%. That's a huge impact. That's effectively like a Great Depression level impact on the US economy. You're talking about 3-4% impact. How do you get there in the next 4 years? Because otherwise you might get a situation where the US government's going to have to keep going into the marketplace and saying, who wants to buy our treasuries? Who wants to buy our bonds? And ultimately, classic example, supply and demand. So far, for the last few decades, it hasn't been a problem. But eventually, you increase supply enough, and demand is going to say, wait a second, I need to get compensated with an appropriate interest rate. And you do create a situation where you sort of get a buyer's strike, and you get higher interest rates, and that ultimately squeezes the market and the economy. So these are the key policies. But I think the elephant in the room remains the U.S. deficit, which frankly, I look at both candidates and that's not their top priority. It's hey, what policies do we want to consider that might get me elected, versus let's have a serious conversation that, what's the country need? I hope this video has been helpful. And if you think I've been overly partisan, in this video, I'd actually love to hear your take, because I really tried to be, unbiased and sort of sharing, like, here are the key policies from the candidates that I've seen. I'm sure I've missed some. If there are some that you feel like I've missed, feel free to call it out in the comments below. And thanks so much for tuning into Unrivaled Investing.